Chapter XXXI. Bad weather, the hydraulic elevator, making window. Glass and tableware, the bread tree, frequent visits to. The corral, the increase of the herd, the reporters. Question: the exact position of Lincoln Island. Pencroff's proposal. The weather changed during the first week in March. There was a full moon in the beginning of the month, and the heat was excessive. The electricity in the air could be felt, and the stormy weather was at hand. On the 2D the thunder was very violent, the wind came out east, and the hail beat against the front of Granite House, pattering like a volley of musketry. It was necessary to fasten the doors and shutters in order to keep the rooms from being inundated. Some of the hailstones were as large as pigeons' eggs, and made Pencroff think of his cornfield. He instantly ran there, and by covering the tiny young sprouts with a large cloth was able to protect them. The sailor was well pelted, but he did not mind that. The stormy weather lasted for 8 days, and the thunder was almost continuous. The heavens were full of lightning, and many trees in the forest were struck, and also a huge pine growing upon the border of the lake. 2 or 3 times the electric fluid struck the beach, melting and vitrifying the sand. Finding these fulgurites, Smith conceived the idea that it would be possible to furnish the windows of Granite House with glass thick and solid enough to resist the wind and rain and hail. The colonists, having no immediate out-of-doors work, profited by the bad weather to complete and perfect the interior arrangements of Granite House. The engineer built a lathe with which they were able to turn some toilet articles and cooking utensils, and also some buttons, the need of which had been pressing. They also made a rack for the arms, which were kept with the utmost care. Nor was Jup forgotten. He occupied a chamber apart, a sort of cabin with a frame always full of good bedding, which suited him exactly. "There's no such thing as fault finding with Jup," said Pencroff. "What a servant he is, Neb. He is my pupil and almost my equal." "He's your superior," laughed the sailor, "as you can talk, Neb, and he cannot." Jup had by this time become perfectly familiar with all the details of his work. He brushed the clothes, turned the spit, swept the rooms, waited at table, and, what delighted Pencroff, never laid down at night before he had tucked the worthy sailor in his bed. As to the health of the colony, bipeds and bimana, quadrupeds and quadrumana, it left nothing to be desired. With the out-of-doors work, on this salubrious soil, under this temperate zone, laboring with head and hand, they could not believe that they could ever be sick, and all were in splendid health. Herbert had grown a couple of inches during the year, his figure had developed and knitted together, and he promised to become a fine man physically and morally. He profited by the lessons which he learned practically and from the books in the chest, and he found in the engineer and the reporter masters pleased to teach him. It was the engineer's desire to teach the lad all he himself knew. "If I die," thought Smith, "he will take my place." The storm ended on the 9th of March, but the sky remained clouded during the remainder of the month, and, with the exception of 2 or 3 fine days, rainy or foggy. About this time a little onager was born, and a number of mouflons, to the great joy of Neb and Herbert, who had each their favorites among these newcomers. The domestication of peccaries was also attempted, a pen being built near the poultry yard, and a number of the young animals placed therein under Neb's care. Jup was charged with taking them their daily nourishment, the kitchen refuse, and he acquitted himself conscientiously of the task. He did, indeed, cut off their tails, but this was a prank and not naughtiness, because those little twisted appendages amused him like a toy, and his instinct was that of a child. One day in March, Pencroff, talking with the engineer, recalled to his mind a promise made some time before. "You have spoken of something to take the place of our long ladder, Mr. Smith. Will you make it some day?" "You mean a kind of elevator?" answered Smith. "Call it an elevator if you wish," responded the sailor. "The name does not matter, provided we can get to our house easily." "Nothing is easier, Pencroff, but is it worthwhile?" "Certainly, sir, it is. After we have the necessaries, let us think of the conveniences. For people this will be a luxury, if you choose, but for things, it is indispensable. It is not so easy to climb a long ladder when one is heavily loaded." "Well, Pencroff, we will try to satisfy you," answered Smith. "But you haven't the machine, We will make one. To go by steam. No, to go by water. Indeed, a natural force was at hand. All that was necessary was to enlarge the passage which furnished Granite House with water, and make a fall at the end of the corridor. Above this fall the engineer placed a paddle wheel, and wrapped around its axle a strong rope attached to a basket. In this manner, by means of a long cord which reached to the ground, they could raise or lower the basket by means of the hydraulic motor. On the 17th of March the elevator was used for the first time, and after that everything was hoisted into Granite House by its means. Top was particularly pleased by this improvement, as he could not climb like Jup, and he had often made the ascent on the back of Neb or of the orang. Smith also attempted to make glass, which was difficult enough, but after numerous attempts he succeeded in establishing a glass works at the old pottery, where Herbert and Spilett spent several days. The substances entering into the composition of glass, sand, chalk, and soda, the engineer had at hand, but the cane of the glassmaker, an iron tube 5 or 6 feet long, was wanting. This Pencroff, however, succeeded in making, and on the 28th of March the furnace was heated. 100 parts of sand, 35 of chalk, 40 of sulfate of soda, mixed with 2 of 3 parts of powdered charcoal, composed the substance which was placed in earthen vessels and melted to a liquid, or rather to the consistency of paste. Smith culled a certain quantity of this paste with his cane, and turned it back and forth on a metal plate so placed that it could be blown on. Then he passed the cane to Herbert, telling him to blow in it. As you do to make soap bubbles. Exactly. So Herbert, puffing out his cheeks, blew through the cane, which he kept constantly turning about, in such a manner as to inflate the vitreous mass. Other quantities of the substance in fusion were added to the first, and the result was a bubble, measuring a foot in diameter. Then Smith took the cane again, and swinging it like a pendulum, he made this bubble lengthen into the shape of cylinder. This cylinder was terminated at either end by 2 hemispherical caps, which were easily cut off by means of a sharp iron dipped in cold water. In the same way the cylinder was cut lengthwise, and after having been heated a second time it was spread on the plate and smoothed with a wooden roller. Thus the first glass was made, and by repeating the operation 50 times they had as many glasses, and the windows of Granite House were soon garnished with transparent panes, not very clear, perhaps, but clear enough. As to the glassware, that was mere amusement. They took whatever shape happened to come at the end of the cane. Pencroff had asked to be allowed to blow in his turn and he enjoyed it, but he blew so hard that his products took the most diverting forms, which pleased him amazingly. During one of the excursions undertaken about this time a new tree was discovered, whose products added much to the resources of the colony. Smith and Herbert, being out hunting one day, went into the forests of the far west, and as usual the lad asked the engineer 1,000 questions, and as Smith was no sportsman, and Herbert was deep in physics and chemistry, the game did not suffer, and so it fell out that the day was nearly ended, and the 2 hunters were likely to have made a useless excursion, when Herbert, stopping suddenly, exclaimed joyfully, "Oh, Mr. Smith, do you see that tree?" And he pointed out a shrub rather than a tree, as it was composed of a single stem with a scaly bark, and leaves striped with small parallel veins. "It looks like a small palm." "What is it?" asked Smith. "It is a cycas revoluta about which I have read in our Dictionary of Natural History. But I see no fruit on this shrub." "No, sir, but its trunk contains a flower which nature furnishes all ground." "Is it a bread tree?" "That's it, exactly." "Then, my boy, since we are waiting for our wheat crop, this is a valuable discovery. Examine it, and pray heaven you are not mistaken." Herbert was not mistaken. He broke the stem of the cycas, which was composed of a glandular tissue containing a certain quantity of farinaceous flour, traversed by ligneous fibers and separated by concentric rings of the same substance. From the fecula oozed a sticky liquid of a disagreeable taste, but this could readily be removed by pressure. The substance itself formed a real flour of superior quality, extremely nourishing, and which used to be forbidden exportation by the laws of Japan. Smith and Herbert, after bearing carefully noted the location of the cycas, returned to Granite House and made known their discovery, and the next day all the colonists went to the place, and Pencroff, jubilant, asked the engineer, "Mr. Smith, Do you believe there are such things as castaways' islands? What do you mean, Pencroff? Well, I mean islands made especially for people to be shipwrecked upon, where the poor devils could always get along. Perhaps, said the engineer, smiling. Certainly, answered the sailor, and just as certainly Lincoln Island is one of them. They returned to Granite House with an ample supply of cycas stems, and the engineer made a press by which the liquid was expelled, and they obtained a goodly quantity of flour which Neb transformed into cakes and puddings. They had not yet real wheaten bread, but it was the next thing to do. The onager, the goats, and the sheep in the corral furnished a daily supply of milk to the colony, and the cart, or rather a light wagon, which had taken its place, made frequent trips to the corral. And when Pencroff's turn came, he took Jup along, and made him drive, and Jup, cracking his whip, acquitted himself with his usual intelligence. Thus everything prospered, and the colonists, if they had not been so far from their country, would have had nothing to complain of. They liked the life, and they were so accustomed to the island that they would have left it with regret. Nevertheless, such is man's love of country, that had a ship hove in sight the colonists would have signaled it, have gone aboard and departed. Meantime, they lived this happy life, and they had rather to fear than to wish for any interruption of its course. But who is able to flatter himself that he has attained his fortune and reached the summit of his desires? The colonists often discussed the nature of their island, which they had inhabited for more than a year, and one day a remark was made which was destined, later, to bring about the most serious result. It was the 1st of April, a Sunday, and the Paschal feast, which Smith and his companions had sanctified by rest and prayer. The day had been lovely, like a day in October in the northern hemisphere. Towards evening all were seated in the arbor on the edge of the plateau, watching the gradual approach of night, and drinking some of Neb's elderberry coffee. They had been talking of the island and its isolated position in the Pacific, when something made Spilett say, "By the way, Cyrus, have you ever taken the position of the island again since you have had the sextant?" "No," answered the engineer. "Well, wouldn't it be well enough to do so?" "What would be the use?" asked Pencroff. "The island is well enough where it is." "Doubtless," answered Spilett, "but it is possible that the imperfections of the other instruments may have caused an error in that observation, and since it is easy to verify it exactly." "You are right, Spilett," responded the engineer, "and I would have made this verification before, only that if I have made an error it cannot exceed 5 degrees in latitude or longitude." "Who knows," replied the reporter, "who knows but that we are much nearer an inhabited land than we believe?" "We will know tomorrow," responded the engineer, "and had it not been for the other work, which has left us no leisure, we would have known already." "Well," said Pencroff, "Mr. Smith is too good an observer to have been mistaken, and if the island has not moved, it is just where he put it." So the next day the engineer made the observations with the sextant with the following result: longitude 150 degrees 30 west, latitude 34 degrees 57 south. The previous observation had given the situation of the island as between longitude 150 degrees and 155 degrees west, and latitude 36 degrees and 35 degrees south, so that, notwithstanding the rudeness of his apparatus, Smith's error had not been more than 5 degrees. "Now," said Spilett, "since, beside a sextant, we have an atlas, see, my dear Cyrus, the exact position of Lincoln Island in the Pacific." Herbert brought the atlas, which it will be remembered gave the nomenclature in the French language, and the volume was opened at the map of the Pacific. The engineer, compass in hand, was about to determine their situation, when, suddenly he paused, exclaiming, "Why, there is an island marked in this part of the Pacific." "An island?" cried Pencroff. "Doubtless it is ours," added Spilett. "No," replied Smith. "This island is situated in 153 degrees of longitude and 37 degrees 11 of latitude." "And what's the name?" asked Herbert. "Tabor Island." "Is it important?" "No, it is an island lost in the Pacific, and which has never, perhaps, been visited." "Very well, we will visit it," said Pencroff. "We?" "Yes, sir, we will build a decked boat, and I will undertake to steer her." "How far are we from this Tabor Island?" 150 miles to the northeast." Is that all? Responded Pencroff. Why, in 48 hours, with a good breeze, we will be there. But what would be the use? Asked the reporter. We cannot tell till we see it. And upon this response it was decided that a boat should be built so that it might be launched by about the next October, on the return of good weather. Chapter XXG. Shipbuilding, the second harvest, AI hunting, a new plant, a whale, the harpoon from the vineyard. Cutting up this cetacea, use of the whalebone, the end of May, Pencroff is content. When Pencroff was possessed of an idea, he would not rest till it was executed. Now, he wanted to visit Tabor Island, and as a boat of some size was necessary, therefore the boat must be built. He and the engineer accordingly determined upon the following model. The boat was to measure 35 feet on the keel by 9 feet beam, with the lines of a racer, and to draw 6 feet of water, which would be sufficient to prevent her making leeway. She was to be flush-decked, with the 2 hatchways into 2 holds separated by a partition, and sloop-rigged with mainsail, topsail, jib, stormjib and brigantine, a rig easily handled, manageable in a squall, and excellent for lying close in the wind. Her hull was to be constructed of planks, edge to edge, that is, not overlapping, and her timbers would be bent by steam after the planking had been adjusted to a false frame. On the question of wood, whether to use elm or deal, they decided on the latter as being easier to work, and supporting immersion in water the better. These details having been arranged, it was decided that, as the fine weather would not return before 6 months, Smith and Pencroff should do this work alone. Spilett and Herbert were to continue hunting, and Neb and his assistant, Master Jup, were to attend to the domestic cares as usual. At once trees were selected and cut down and sawed into planks, and a week later a shipyard was made in the hollow between Granite House and the cliff, and a keel 35 feet long, with stern post and stem lay upon the sand. Smith had not entered blindly upon this undertaking. He understood marine construction as he did almost everything else, and he had first drawn the model on paper. Moreover, he was well aided by Pencroff, who had worked as a ship carpenter. It was, therefore, only after deep thought and careful calculation that the false frame was raised on the keel. Pencroff was very anxious to begin the new enterprise, and but one thing took him away, and then only for a day, from the work. This was the second harvest, which was made on the 15th of April. It resulted as before, and yielded the proportion of grains calculated. 5 bushels, Mr. Smith said Pencroff, after having scrupulously measured these riches. 5 bushels, answered the engineer, or 650,000 grains of corn. Well, we will sow them all this time, excepting a small reserve. Yes, and if the next harvest is proportional to this we will have 4,000 bushels. And we will eat bread. We will, indeed. But we must build a mill. We will build one. The third field of corn, though incomparably larger than the others, was prepared with great care and received the precious seed. Then Pencroff returned to his work. In the meantime, Spilett and Herbert hunted in the neighborhood, or with their guns loaded with ball, adventured into the unexplored depths of the far west. It was an inextricable tangle of great trees growing close together. The exploration of those thick masses was very difficult, and the engineer never undertook it without taking with him the pocket compass, as the sun was rarely visible through the leaves. Naturally, game was not plenty in these thick undergrowths, but 3 urry were shot during the last fortnight in April, and their skins were taken to Granite House, where they received a sort of tanning with sulphuric acid. On the 30th of April, a discovery, valuable for another reason, was made by Spilett. The 2 hunters were deep in the southwestern part of the far west when the reporter, walking some 50 paces ahead of his companion, came to a sort of glade, and was surprised to perceive an odor proceeding from certain straight-stemmed plants, cylindrical and branching, and bearing bunches of flowers and tiny seeds. The reporter broke off some of these stems, and, returning to the lad, asked him if he knew what they were. "Where did you find this plant?" asked Herbert. "Over there in the glade, there is plenty of it." "Well, this is a discovery that gives you Pencroff's everlasting gratitude." "Is it tobacco?" "Yes, and if it is not first quality it is all the same, tobacco." "Good Pencroff, how happy he'll be." But he cannot smoke all. He'll have to leave some for us. I'll tell you what, sir. Let us say nothing to Pencroff until the tobacco has been prepared, and then some fine day we will hand him a pipe full. And you may be sure, Herbert, that on that day the good fellow will want nothing else in the world. The two smuggled a good supply of the plant into Granite House with as much precaution as if Pencroff had been the strictest of custom house officers. Smith and Neb were let into the secret, but Pencroff never suspected anything during the 2 months it took to prepare the leaves, as he was occupied all day at the shipyard. On the 1st of May the sailor was again interrupted at his favorite work by a fishing adventure, in which all the colonists took part. For some days they had noticed an enormous animal swimming in the sea some 2 or 3 miles distant from the shore. It was a huge whale, apparently belonging to the species Australis, called Cape whales. "How lucky for us if we could capture it!" cried the sailor. "Oh, if we only had a suitable boat and a harpoon ready, so that I could say, 'Let's go for him. For he's worth all the trouble he'll give us.' Well, Pencroff, I should like to see you manage a harpoon. It must be interesting." "Interesting and somewhat dangerous," said the engineer, "but since we have not the means to attack this animal, it is useless to think about him. I am astonished to see a whale in such comparatively high latitude. Why, Mr. Spilett, we are in that very part of the Pacific which whalers call the whale field, and just here whales are found in the greatest number." "That is so," said Pencroff, "and I wonder we have not seen one before, but it don't matter much since we cannot go to it." And the sailor turned with a sigh to his work, as all sailors are fishermen, and if the sport is proportionate to the size of the game, one can imagine what a whaler must feel in the presence of a whale. But, aside from the sport, such spoil would have been very acceptable to the colony, as the oil, the fat, and the fins could be turned to various uses. It appeared as if the animal did not wish to leave these waters. He kept swimming about in Union Bay for 2 days, now approaching the shore, when his black body could be seen perfectly, and again darting through the water or spouting vapor to a vast height in the air. Its presence continually engaged the thoughts of the colonists, and Pencroff was like a child longing for some forbidden object. Fortune, however, did for the colonists what they could not have done for themselves, and on the 3rd of May, Neb looking from his kitchen shouted that the whale was aground on the island. Herbert and Spilett, who were about starting on a hunt, laid aside their guns, Pencroff dropped his hatchet, and Smith and Neb, joining their companions, hurried down to the shore. It had grounded on Jetsam Point at high water, and it was not likely that the monster would be able to get off easily, but they must hasten in order to cut off its retreat if necessary. So seizing some picks and spears they ran across the bridge, down the Mersey and along the shore, and in less than 20 minutes the party were beside the huge animal, above whom myriads of birds were already hovering. "What a monster!" exclaimed Neb. And the term was proper, as it was one of the largest of the southern whales, measuring 45 feet in length and weighing not less than 150,000 pounds. Meantime the animal, although the tide was still high, made no effort to get off the shore, and the reason for this was explained later when at low water the colonists walked around its body. It was dead, and a harpoon protruded from its left flank. "Are there whalers in our neighborhood?" asked Spilett. "Why do you ask?" "Since the harpoon is still there." "Oh, that proves nothing, sir," said Pencroff. "Whales sometimes go thousands of miles with a harpoon in them, and I should not be surprised if this one which came to die here had been struck in the North Atlantic." "Nevertheless," began Spilett, not satisfied with Pencroff's affirmation. "It is perfectly possible," responded the engineer, "but let us look at the harpoon. Probably it will have the name of the ship on it." Pencroff drew out the harpoon, and read this inscription: "Maria Stella Vineyard. A ship from the Vineyard. A ship of my country." "Be cried. The Maria Stella. A good whaler. And I know her well. Oh, my friends, a ship from the Vineyard. A whaler from the Vineyard." And the sailor, brandishing the harpoon, continued to repeat that name dear to his heart, the name of his birthplace. But as they could not wait for the Maria Stella to come and reclaim their prize, the colonists resolved to cut it up before decomposition set in. The birds of prey were already anxious to become possessors of the spoil, and it was necessary to drive them away with gunshots. The whale was a female, and her udders furnished a great quantity of milk, which, according to Diefenbach, resembles in taste, color, and density, the milk of cows. As Pencroff had served on a whaler, he was able to direct the disagreeable work of cutting up the animal, an operation which lasted during 3 days. The blubber, cut in strips 2.5 feet thick and divided into pieces weighing 1,000 pounds each, was melted down in large earthen vats, which had been brought onto the ground. And such was its abundance, that notwithstanding a third of its weight was lost by melting, the ton alone yielded 6,000 pounds of oil. The colonists were therefore supplied with an abundant supply of stearin and glycerin, and there was, besides, the whalebone, which would find its use, although there were neither umbrellas nor corsets in Granite House. The operation ended, to the great satisfaction of the colonists. The rest of the animal was left to the birds, who made away with it to the last vestiges, and the daily routine of work was resumed. Still, before going to the shipyard, Smith worked on certain affairs which excited the curiosity of his companions. He took a dozen of the plates of baleen, the solid whalebone, which he cut into 6 equal lengths, sharpened at the ends. "And what is that for?" asked Herbert, when they were finished. "To kill foxes, wolves, and jaguars," answered the engineer. "Now?" "No, but this winter, when we have the ice." "I don't understand," answered Herbert. "You shall understand, my lad," answered the engineer. "This is not my invention, it is frequently employed by the inhabitants of the Aleutian Islands. These whalebones which you see, when the weather is freezing I will bend round and freeze in that position with a coating of ice, then having covered them with a bit of fat, I will place them in the snow. Supposing a hungry animal swallows one of these baits. The warmth will thaw the ice, and the whalebone, springing back, will pierce the stomach." "That is ingenious," said Pencroff. "And it will save powder and ball," said Smith. "It will be better than the traps. Just wait till winter comes." The shipbuilding continued, and towards the end of the month the little vessel was half finished. Pencroff worked almost too hard, but his companions were secretly preparing a recompense for all his toil, and the 31st of May was destined to be one of the happiest times in his life. After dinner on that day, just as he was leaving table, Pencroff felt a hand on his shoulder and heard Spilett saying to him, "Don't go yet a while, Pencroff. You forget the dessert." "Thank you, Spilett, but I must get back to work." "Oh, well, have a cup of coffee." "Not any." "Well, then, a pipe." Pencroff started up quickly, and when he saw the reporter holding him a pipe full of tobacco, and Herbert with a light, his honest, homely face grew pale, and he could not say a word, but taking the pipe, he placed it to his lips, lit it, and drew 5 or 6 long puffs, one after the other. A fragrant, bluish-colored smoke filled the air, and from the depths of this cloud came a voice, delirious with joy, repeating, "Tobacco! Real tobacco!" "Yes," Pencroff answered Smith, "and good tobacco at that." "Heaven be praised!" ejaculated the sailor. "Nothing now is wanting in our island." And he puffed and puffed and puffed. "Who found it?" he asked, at length. "It was you, Herbert, I suppose." "No, Pencroff, it was Mr. Spilett." "Mr. Spilett!" cried the sailor, hugging the reporter, who had never been treated that way before. "Yes, Pencroff, taking advantage of a cessation in the embrace to get his breath, but include in your thanksgiving Herbert, who recognized the plant, Mr. Smith, who prepared it, and Neb, who has found it hard to keep the secret. Well, my friends, I will repay you for this some day. Meanwhile I am eternally grateful. Chapter XXXIII. Winter, fulling cloth, the mill, Pencroff's fixed purpose, the whalebones, the use of an albatross, top, and JUP, storms, damage to the poultry yard, an excursion to the marsh, Smith alone, exploration of the pits. Winter came with June, and the principal work was the making of strong warm clothing. The mouflons had been clipped, and the question was how to transform the wool into cloth. Smith, not having any mill machinery, was obliged to proceed in the simplest manner, in order to economize the spinning and weaving. Therefore he proposed to make use of the property possessed by the filaments of wool of binding themselves together under pressure, and making by their mere entanglement the substance known as felt. This felt can be obtained by a simple fulling, an operation which, while it diminishes the suppleness of the stuff, greatly augments its heat-preserving qualities, and as the mouflon's wool was very short it was in good condition for felting. The engineer, assisted by his companions, including Pencroff, who had to leave his ship again, cleansed the wool of the grease and oil by soaking it in warm water and washing it with soda, and, when it was partially dried by pressure it was in a condition to be milled, that is, to produce a solid stuff, too coarse to be of any value in the industrial centers of Europe, but valuable enough in the Lincoln Island market. The engineer's professional knowledge was of great service in constructing the machine destined to mill the wool, as he knew how to make ready use of the power, unemployed up to this time, in the waterfall at the cliff, to move a fulling mill. Its construction was most simple. A tree furnished with cams, which raised and dropped the vertical millers, troughs for the wool, into which the millers fell, a strong wooden building containing and sustaining the contrivance, such was the machine in question. The work, superintended by Smith, resulted admirably. The wool, previously impregnated with a soapy solution, came from the mill in the shape of a thick felt cloth. The striae and roughnesses of the material had caught and blended together so thoroughly that they formed a stuff equally suitable for cloths or coverings. It was not, indeed, one of the stuffs of commerce, but it was Lincoln felt, and the island had one more industry. The colonists, being thus provided with good clothes and warm bed clothing, saw the winter of 1866–67 approach without any dread. The cold really began to be felt on the 20th of June, and, to his great regret, Pencroff was obliged to suspend work on his vessel, although it would certainly be finished by the next spring. The fixed purpose of the sailor was to make a voyage of discovery to Tabor Island, although Smith did not approve of this voyage of simple curiosity, as there was evidently no succor to be obtained from that desert and half-arid rock. A voyage of 150 miles in a boat, comparatively small, in the midst of unknown seas, was cause for considerable anxiety. If the frail craft, once at sea, should be unable to reach Tabor Island, or to return to Lincoln Island, what would become of her in the midst of this ocean so fertile in disasters? Smith often talked of this project with Pencroff, and he found in the sailor a strange obstinacy to make the voyage, an obstinacy for which Pencroff himself could not account. "Well," said the engineer one day, "you must see, Pencroff, after having said every good of Lincoln Island, and expressing the regret you would feel should you have to leave it, that you are the first to want to get away." "Only for a day or two," answered Pencroff. "For a few days, Mr. Smith, just long enough to go and return, and see what this island is. But it cannot compare with ours." "I know that." "Then why go?" "To find out what's going on there." "But there is nothing, there can be nothing there." "Who knows?" "And supposing you are caught in a storm?" "That is not likely in that season," replied Pencroff. "But, sir, as it is necessary to foresee everything, I want your permission to take Herbert with me." "Pencroff," said the engineer, laying his hand on the shoulder of the sailor, "if anything should happen to you and this child, whom chance has made our son, do you think that we would ever forgive ourselves?" "Mr. Smith," responded Pencroff with unshaken confidence, "we won't discuss such mishaps. But we will talk again of this voyage when the time comes. Then, I think, when you have seen our boat well rigged, when you have seen how well she behaves at sea, when you have made the tour of the island. As we will, together, I think, I say, that you will not hesitate to let me go. I do not conceal from you that this will be a fine work, your ship." "Say rather, our ship," Pencroff replied the engineer, momentarily disarmed. And the conversation, to be renewed later, ended without convincing either of the speakers. The first snow fell towards the end of the month. The corral had been well provisioned, and there was no further necessity for daily visits, but it was decided to go there at least once a week. The traps were set again, and the contrivances of Smith were tried, and worked perfectly. The bent whalebones, frozen, and covered with fat, were placed near the edge of the forest, at a place frequented by animals, and some dozen foxes, some wild boars, and a jaguar were found killed by this means, their stomachs perforated by the straightened whalebones. At this time, an experiment, thought of by the reporter, was made. It was the first attempt of the colonists to communicate with their kindred. Spilett had already often thought of throwing a bottle containing a writing into the sea, to be carried by the currents, perhaps, to some inhabited coast, or to make use of the pigeons. But it was pure folly to seriously believe that pigeons or bottles could cross the 1,200 miles separating the island from all lands. But on the 30th of June they captured, not without difficulty, an albatross, which Herbert had slightly wounded in the foot. It was a splendid specimen of its kind, its wings measuring 10 feet from tip to tip, and it could cross seas as vast as the Pacific. Herbert would have liked to have kept the bird and tamed it, but Spilett made him understand that they could not afford to neglect this chance of corresponding by means of this courier with the Pacific coasts. So Herbert gave up the bird, as, if it had come from some inhabited region, it was likely to return there if at liberty. Perhaps, in his heart, Spilett, to whom the journalistic spirit returned sometimes, did not regret giving to the winds an interesting article relating the adventures of the colonists of Lincoln Island. What a triumph for the reporters of the New York Herald, and for the issue containing the Chronicle, if ever the latter should reach his director, the Honorable John Bennett. Spilett, therefore, wrote out a succinct article, which was then closed in a waterproof cloth bag, with the request to whoever found it to send it to one of the offices of the Herald. This little bag was fastened around the neck of the albatross and the bird given its freedom, and it was not without emotion that the colonists saw this rapid courier of the air disappear in the western clouds. "Where does he go that way?" asked Pencroff. "Towards New Zealand," answered Herbert. "May he have a good voyage," said the sailor, who did not expect much from this method of communication. With the winter, indoor work was resumed, old clothes were repaired, new garments made, and the sails of the sloop made from the inexhaustible envelope of the balloon. During July the cold was intense, but coal and wood were abundant, and Smith had built another chimney in the great hall, where they passed the long evenings. It was a great comfort to the colonists, when, seated in this well-lighted and warm hall, a good dinner finished, coffee steaming in the cups, the pipes emitting a fragrant smoke, they listened to the roar of the tempest without. They were perfectly comfortable, if that is possible where one is far from his kindred and without possible means of communicating with them. They talked about their country, of their friends at home, of the grandeur of the Republic, whose influence must increase, and Smith, who had had much to do with the affairs of the Union, entertained his hearers with his stories, his perceptions and his prophecies. One evening as they had been sitting talking in this way for some time, they were interrupted by Top, who began barking in that peculiar way which had previously attracted the attention of the engineer, and running around the mouth of the well which opened at the end of the inner corridor. "Why is Top barking that way again?" asked Pencroff. "And Jup growling so?" added Herbert. Indeed, both the dog and the orang gave unequivocal signs of agitation, and curiously enough these two animals seemed to be more alarmed than irritated. "It is evident," said Spilett, "that this well communicates directly with the sea, and that some animal comes to breathe in its depths. It must be so, since there is no other explanation to give. Be quiet, Top. And you, Jup. Go to your room." The animals turned away, Jup went to his bed, but Top remained in the hall, and continued whining the remainder of the evening. It was not, however, the question of this incident that darkened the countenance of the engineer. During the remainder of the month, rain and snow alternated, and though the temperature was not as low as during the preceding winter, there were more storms and gales. On more than one occasion the chimneys had been threatened by the waves, and it seemed as if an upraising of the sea, caused by some submarine convulsion, raised the monstrous billows and hurled them against Granite House. During these storms it was difficult, even dangerous, to attempt using the roads on the island, as the trees were falling constantly. Nevertheless, the colonists never let a week pass without visiting the corral, and happily this enclosure, protected by the spur of the mountain, did not suffer from the storms. But the poultry yard, from its position, exposed to the blast, suffered considerable damage. Twice the pigeon house was unroofed, and the fence also was demolished, making it necessary to rebuild it more solidly. It was evident that Lincoln Island was situated in the worst part of the Pacific. Indeed, It seemed as if the island formed the central point of vast cyclones which whipped it as if it were a top, only in this case the top was immovable and the whip spun about. During the first week in August the storm abated, and the atmosphere recovered a calm which it seemed never to have lost. With the calm the temperature lowered, and the thermometer of the colonists indicated 8 degrees below zero. On the 3rd of August, an excursion, which had been planned for some time, was made to Tadorn's Fen. The hunters were tempted by the great number of aquatic birds which made these marshes their home, and not only Spilett and Herbert, but Pencroff and Neb took part in the expedition. Smith alone pleaded some excuse for remaining behind at Granite House. The hunters promised to return by evening. Top and Jup accompanied them. And when they had crossed the bridge over the Mersey the engineer left them, and returned with the idea of executing a project in which he wished to be alone. This was to explore minutely the well opening into the corridor. Why did Top run round this place so often? Why did he whine in that strange way? Why did Jup share Top's anxiety? Had this well other branches beside the communication with the sea? Did it ramify towards other portions of the island? This is what Smith wanted to discover, and, moreover, to be alone in his discovery. He had resolved to make this exploration during the absence of his companions, and here was the opportunity. It was easy to descend to the bottom of the well by means of the ladder, which had not been used since the elevator had taken its place. The engineer dragged this ladder to the opening of the well, and, having made fast one end, let it unroll itself into the abyss. Then, having lit a lantern, and placing a revolver and cutlass in his belt, he began to descend the rungs. The sides of the well were smooth, but some projections of rocks appeared at intervals, and by means of these projections an athlete could have raised himself to the mouth of the well. The engineer noticed this, but in throwing the light of the lantern on these points he could discover nothing to indicate that they had ever been used in that way. Smith descended deeper, examining every part of the well, but he saw nothing suspicious. When he had reached the lowermost rung, he was at the surface of the water, which was perfectly calm. Neither there, nor in any other part of the well, was there any lateral opening. The wall, struck by the handle of Smith's cutlass, sounded solid. It was a compact mass, through which no human being could make his way. In order to reach the bottom of the well, and from thence climb to its mouth, it was necessary to traverse the submerged passage under the shore, which connected with the sea, and this was only possible for marine animals. As to knowing whereabouts on the shore, and at what depth under the waves, this passage came out, that was impossible to discover. Smith, having ended his exploration, remounted the ladder, covered over again the mouth of the well, and returned thoughtfully to the great hall of Granite House, saying to himself, "I have seen nothing, and yet, there is something there." Chapter 6. Rigging the launch, attacked by foxes, Jup wounded. Jup nursed, Jup cured, completion of the launch. Pencroff's triumph, the good luck, trial trip, to the south of the island, an unexpected document. The same evening the hunters returned, fairly loaded down with game, the 4 men having all they could carry. Top had a circlet of ducks round his neck, and Jup belts of woodcock round his body. "See, my master," cried Neb, "see how we have used our time. Preserves, pies, we will have a good reserve. But someone must help me, and I count upon you, Pencroff." "No," Neb responded the sailor, "the rigging of the launch occupies my time, and you will have to do without me." "And you, Master Herbert?" "I, Neb, must go tomorrow to the corral." "Then will you help me, Mr. Spilett?" "To oblige you, I will," Neb answered the reporter, "but I warn you that if you discover your recipes to me I will publish them." "Whenever you choose, sir," responded Neb, "whenever you choose." And so the next day the reporter was installed as Neb's aide in his culinary laboratory. But beforehand the engineer had given him the result of the previous day's exploration, and Spilett agreed with Smith in his opinion that, although he had found out nothing, still there was a secret to be discovered. The cold continued a week longer, and the colonists did not leave Granite House excepting to look after the poultry yard. The dwelling was perfumed by the good odors which the learned manipulations of Neb and the reporter emitted, but all the products of the hunt in the fen had not been made into preserves, and as the game kept perfectly in the intense cold, wild ducks and others, were eaten fresh, and declared better than any waterfowl in the world. During the week, Pencroff, assisted by Herbert, who used the sailor's needle skillfully, worked with such diligence that the sails of the launch were finished. Thanks to the rigging which had been recovered with the envelope of the balloon, hemp cordage was not wanting. The sails were boarded by strong bolt ropes, and there was enough left to make halyards, shrouds, and sheets. The pulleys were made by Smith on the lathe which he had set up, acting under Pencroff's instruction. The rigging was, therefore, completed before the launch was finished. Pencroff made a red, white, and blue flag, getting the dye from certain plants, but to the 37 stars representing the 37 states of the Union, the sailor added another star, the star of the state of Lincoln, as he considered his island as already annexed to the Great Republic. And said he, "It is in spirit, if it is not in fact." For the present the flag was unfurled from the central window of Granite House and saluted with 3 cheers. Meantime, they had reached the end of the cold season, and it seemed as if this second winter would pass without any serious event, when during the night of the 11th of August, Prospect Plateau was menaced by a complete devastation. After a busy day the colonists were sleeping soundly, when towards 4 o'clock in the morning, they were suddenly awakened by Top's barking. The dog did not bark this time at the mouth of the pit, but at the door, and he threw himself against it as if he wished to break it open. Jup, also, uttered sharp cries. "Be quiet, Top!" cried Neb, who was the first awake. But the dog only barked the louder. "What's the matter?" cried Smith. And every one, dressing in haste, hurried to the windows and opened them. Beneath them a fall of snow shone white through the darkness. The colonists could see nothing, but they heard curious barkings penetrating the night. It was evident that the shore had been invaded by a number of animals which they could not see. "What can they be?" cried Pencroff. "Wolves, jaguars, or monkeys," replied Neb. "The mischief! They can get onto the plateau!" exclaimed the reporter. "And our poultry yard, and our garden!" cried Herbert. "How have they got in?" asked Pencroff. "They have come through the causeway," answered the engineer, "which one of us must have forgotten to close." "In truth," said Spilett, "I remember that I left it open." "A nice mess you have made of it, sir!" cried the sailor. "What is done, replied Spilett. "Let us consider what it is necessary to do." These questions and answers passed rapidly between Smith and his companions. It was certain that the causeway had been passed, that the shore had been invaded by animals, and that, whatever they were, they could gain Prospect Plateau by going up the left bank of the Mercy. It was, therefore, necessary quickly to overtake them, and, if necessary, to fight them. "But what are they?" somebody asked a second time, as the barking resounded more loudly. Herbert started at the sound, and he remembered having heard it during his first visit to the sources of Red Creek. "They are foxes. They are foxes," he said. "Come on!" cried the sailor. And all, armed with hatchets, carbines, and revolvers, hurried into the elevator, and were soon on the shore. These foxes are dangerous animals, when numerous or irritated by hunger. Nevertheless, the colonists did not hesitate to throw themselves into the midst of the band, and their first shots, darting bright gleams through the darkness, drove back the foremost assailants. It was most important to prevent these thieves from gaining Prospect Plateau, as the garden and the poultry yard would have been at their mercy, and the result would have been immense, perhaps, irreparable damage, especially to the cornfield. But as the plateau could only be invaded by the left bank of the Mercy, it would suffice to oppose a barrier to the foxes on the narrow portion of the shore comprised between the river and the granite wall. This was apparent to all, and under Smith's direction the party gained this position and disposed themselves so as to form an impassable line. Top, his formidable jaws open, preceded the colonists, and was followed by Jup, armed with a knotty cudgel, which he brandished like a cricket bat. The night was very dark, and it was only by the flash of the discharges that the colonists could perceive their assailants, who numbered at least 100, and whose eyes shone like embers. "They must not pass!" cried Pencroff. "They shall not pass!" answered the engineer. But if they did not, it was not because they did not try. Those behind kept pushing on those in front, and it was an incessant struggle, the colonists using their hatchets and revolvers. Already the dead bodies of the foxes were strewn over the ground, but the band did not seem to lessen, and it appeared as if reinforcements were constantly pouring in through the causeway on the shore. Meantime the colonists fought side by side, receiving some wounds, though happily but trifling. Herbert shot one fox, which had fastened itself on Neb like a tiger cat. Top fought with fury, springing at the throats of the animals and strangling them at once. Jup, armed with his cudgel, laid about him like a good fellow, and it was useless to try to make him stay behind. Gifted, doubtless, with a sight able to pierce the darkness, he was always in the thick of the fight, uttering from time to time a sharp cry, which was with him a mark of extreme jollification. At one time he advanced so far, that by the flash of a revolver he was seen, surrounded by 5 or 6 huge foxes, defending himself with rare coolness. At length the fight ended in a victory for the colonists, but only after 2 hours of resistance. Doubtless the dawn of day determined the retreat of the foxes, who scampered off toward the north across the drawbridge, which Neb ran at once to raise. When daylight lit the battlefield, the colonists counted 50 dead bodies upon the shore. And Jup? Where is Jup? Cried Neb. Jup had disappeared. His friend Neb called him, and for the first time he did not answer the call. Everyone began to search for the monkey, trembling lest they should find him among the dead. At length, under a veritable mound of carcasses, each one marked by the terrible cudgel of the brave animal, they found Jup. The poor fellow still held in his hand the handle of his broken weapon, but deprived of this arm, he had been overpowered by numbers, and deep wounds scored his breast. "He's alive!" cried Neb, who knelt beside him. "And we will save him," answered the sailor, "we will nurse him as one of ourselves." It seemed as if Jup understood what was said, for he laid his head on Pencroff's shoulder as if to thank him. The sailor himself was wounded, but his wounds, like those of his companions, were trifling, as thanks to their firearms, they had always been able to keep the assailants at a distance. Only the orang was seriously hurt. Jup, borne by Neb and Pencroff, was carried to the elevator, and lifted gently to Granite House. There he was laid upon one of the beds, and his wounds carefully washed. No vital organ seemed to have been injured, but the orang was very feeble from loss of blood, and a strong fever had set in. His wounds having been dressed, a strict diet was imposed upon him, just as for a real person Neb said, and they gave him a refreshing draught made from herbs. He slept at first but brokenly, but little by little, his breathing became more regular, and they left him in a heavy sleep. From time to time Top came on tiptoe to visit his friend, and seemed to approve of the attentions which had been bestowed upon it. One of Jup's hands hung over the side of the bed, and Top licked it sympathetically. The same morning they disposed of the dead foxes by dragging the bodies to the far west and burying them there. This attack, which might have been attended with very grave results, was a lesson to the colonists, and thenceforth they never slept before having ascertained that all the bridges were raised and that no invasion was possible. Meantime Jup, after having given serious alarm for some days, began to grow better. The fever abated gradually, and Spilett, who was something of a physician, considered him out of danger. On the 16th of August Jup began to eat. Neb made him some nice, sweet dishes, which the invalid swallowed greedily, for if he had a fault, it was that he was a bit of a glutton, and Neb had never done anything to correct this habit. "What would you have?" he said to Spilett, who sometimes rebuked the negro for indulging him. "Poor Jup has no other pleasure than to eat. And I am only too glad to be able to reward his services in this way." By the 21st of August he was about again. His wounds were healed, and the colonists saw that he would soon recover his accustomed suppleness and vigor. Like other convalescents he was seized with an excessive hunger, and the reporter let him eat what he wished, knowing that the monkey's instinct would preserve him from excess. Neb was overjoyed to see his pupil's appetite returned. "Eat, Jup," he said, "and you shall want for nothing. You have shed your blood for us, and it is right that I should help you to make it again." At length, on the 25th of August, the colonists seated in the great hall, were called by Neb to Jup's room. "What is it?" asked the reporter. Look, answered Neb, laughing, and what did they see but Jup, seated like a Turk within the doorway of Granite House, tranquilly and gravely smoking. My pipe! Cried Pencroff. He has taken my pipe. Well, Jup, I give it to you. Smoke on, my friend, smoke on. And Jup gravely puffed on, seeming to experience the utmost enjoyment. Smith was not greatly astonished at this incident, and he cited numerous examples of tamed monkeys that had become accustomed to the use of tobacco. And after this day Master Jup had his own pipe hung in his room beside his tobacco bag, and, lighting it himself with a live coal, he appeared to be the happiest of quadrumana. It seemed as if this community of taste drew closer together the bonds of friendship already existing between the worthy monkey and the honest sailor. Perhaps he is a man, Pencroff would sometimes say to Neb. Would it astonish you if some day he was to speak? Indeed it would not, replied Neb. The wonder is that he don't do it, as that is all he lacks. Nevertheless, it would be funny if some fine day he said to me, Pencroff, suppose we change pipes. Yes, responded Neb. What a pity he was born mute. Winter ended with September, and the work was renewed with ardor. The construction of the boat advanced rapidly. The planking was completed, and as wood was plenty, Pencroff proposed that they line the interior with a stout ceiling, which would ensure the solidity of the craft. Smith, not knowing what might be in store for them, approved the sailor's idea of making his boat as strong as possible. The ceiling and the deck were finished towards the 13th of September. For caulking, they used some dry wrack, and the seams were then covered with boiling pitch, made from the pine trees of the forest. The arrangement of the boat was simple. She had been ballasted with heavy pieces of granite, set in a bed of lime, and weighing 12,000 pounds. A deck was placed over this ballast, and the interior was divided into two compartments, the larger containing two bunks, which served as chests. The foot of the mast was at the partition separating the compartments, which were entered through hatchways. Pencroff had no difficulty in finding a tree suitable for a mast. He chose a young straight fir, without knots, so that all he had to do was to square the foot and round it off at the head. All the ironwork had been roughly but solidly made at the chimneys, and in the first week of October yards, topmast, spars, oars, etc., everything, in short, was completed, and it was determined that they would first try the craft along the shores of the island, so as to see how she acted. She was launched on the 10th of October. Pencroff was radiant with delight. Completely rigged, she had been pushed on rollers to the edge of the shore, and, as the tide rose, she was floated on the surface of the water, amid the applause of the colonists, and especially of Pencroff, who showed no modesty on this occasion. Moreover, his vanity looked beyond the completion of the craft, as, now that she was built, he was to be her commander. The title of captain was bestowed upon him unanimously. In order to satisfy Captain Pencroff it was necessary at once to name his ship, and after considerable discussion they decided upon Good Luck, the name chosen by the honest sailor. Moreover, as the weather was fine, the breeze fresh, and the sea calm, the trial must be made at once in an excursion along the coast. "Get aboard! Get aboard!" cried Captain Pencroff. At 10:30, after having eaten breakfast and put some provisions aboard, everybody, including Top and Jup, embarked, the sails were hoisted, the flag set at the masthead, and the Good Luck, with Pencroff at the helm, stood out to sea. On going out from Union Bay they had a fair wind, and they were able to see that, sailing before it, their speed was excellent. After doubling Jetsam Point and Claw Cape, Pencroff had to lie close to the wind in order to skirt along the shore, and he observed the Good Luck would sail to within 5 points of the wind, and that she made but little leeway. She sailed very well, also, before the wind, minding her helm perfectly, and gained even in going about. The passengers were enchanted. They had a good boat, which, in case of need, could render them great service, and in this splendid weather, with the fair wind, the sail was delightful. Pencroff stood out to sea 2 or 3 miles, opposite Balloon Harbour, and then the whole varied panorama of the island from Claw Cape to Reptile Promontory was visible under a new aspect. In the foreground were the pine forests, contrasting with the foliage of the other trees, and over all rose Mount Franklin, its head white with snow. "How beautiful it is!" exclaimed Herbert. "Yes, She is a pretty creature, responded Pencroff. I love her as a mother. She received us poor and needy, and what has she denied to these 5 children who tumbled upon her out of the sky? Nothing, Captain, nothing, answered Neb. And the 2 honest fellows gave 3 hearty cheers in honor of their island. Meantime, Spilett, seated by the mast, sketched the panorama before him, while Smith looked on in silence. What do you say of our boat, now, sir? Demanded Pencroff. It acts very well, replied the engineer. Good. And now don't you think it could undertake a voyage of some length? Where, Pencroff? To Tabor Island, for instance. My friend, replied the engineer, I believe that in a case of necessity there need be no hesitancy in trusting to the good luck even for a longer journey, but, you know, I would be sorry to see you leave for Tabor Island, because nothing obliges you to go. One likes to know one's neighbors, answered Pencroff, whose mind was made up. Tabor Island is our neighbor, and is all alone. Politeness requires that at least we make her a visit. The mischief! Exclaimed Spilett, our friend Pencroff is a stickler for propriety. I am not a stickler at all, retorted the sailor, who was a little vexed by the engineer's opposition. Remember, Pencroff, said Smith, that you could not go the island alone. One other would be all I would want. Supposing so, replied the engineer, would you risk depriving our colony of 2 of its colonists? There are 6, rejoined Pencroff. You forget Jup. There are 7, added Neb. Top is as good as another. There is no risk in it, Mr. Smith, said Pencroff again. Possibly not, Pencroff, but, I repeat, that it is exposing oneself without necessity. The obstinate sailor did not answer, but let the conversation drop for the present. He little thought that an incident was about to aid him, and change to a work of humanity what had been merely a caprice open to discussion. The Good Luck, after having stood out to sea, was returning towards the coast and making for Balloon Harbor, as it was important to locate the channelway between the shoals and reefs so as to buoy them, for this little inlet was to be resting place of the sloop. They were half a mile offshore, beating up to windward and moving somewhat slowly, as the boat was under the lee of the land. The sea was as smooth as glass. Herbert was standing in the bows indicating the channelway. Suddenly he cried. Luff, Pencroff, luff. What is it? Cried the sailor, springing to his feet. A rock. No, hold on, I cannot see very well, luff again, steady, bear away a little. And while thus speaking, the lad lay down along the deck, plunged his arm quickly into the water, and then rising up again with something in his hand, exclaimed. It is a bottle. Smith took it, and without saying a word, withdrew the cork and took out a wet paper, on which was written these words. A shipwrecked man, Tabor Island, L53° W long dot, 37° 11 S lat. Chapter XXXV. Departure decided upon, preparations, the 3. Passengers, the first night, the second night, Tabor Island, search on the shore, search in the woods, no. 1. Animals, plants, a house, deserted. Someone shipwrecked. Cried Pencroff, abandoned some 100 miles from us upon Tabor Island. Oh. Mr. Smith, you will no longer oppose my project. No, Pencroff, and you must leave as soon as possible. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. The engineer held the paper which he had taken from the bottle in his hand. He considered for a few moments, and then spoke. From this paper, my friends, said he, and from the manner in which it is worded, we must conclude that, in the first place, the person cast away upon Tabor Island is a man well informed, since he gives the latitude and longitude of his island exactly. Secondly, that he is English or American, since the paper is written in English. That is a logical conclusion, answered Spilett, and the presence of this person explains the arrival of the box on our coast. There has been a shipwreck. Since someone has been shipwrecked. And he is fortunate in that Pencroff had the idea of building this boat and even of trying it today, for in 24 hours the bottle would have been broken on the rocks. Indeed, said Herbert, it is a happy chance that the Good Luck passed by the very spot where this bottle was floating. Don't it seem to you odd? Asked Smith of Pencroff. It seems fortunate, "That's all," replied the sailor. "Do you see anything extraordinary in it, sir? This bottle must have gone somewhere, and why not here as well as anywhere else?" "Perhaps you are right," Pencroff responded the engineer, "and nevertheless—" "But," interrupted Herbert, "nothing proves that this bottle has floated in the water for a long time." "Nothing," responded Spilett, "and moreover the paper seems to have been recently written. What do you think, Cyrus?" "It is hard to decide," answered Smith. Meanwhile Pencroff had not been idle. He had gone about, and the Good Luck, with a free wind, all her sails drawing, was speeding toward Claw Cape. Each one thought of the castaway on Tabor Island. Was there still time to save him? This was a great event in the lives of the colonists. They too were but castaways, but it was not probable that another had been as favored as they had been, and it was their duty to hasten at once to this one's relief. By 2 o'clock Claw Cape was doubled, and the Good Luck anchored at the mouth of the Mercy. That evening all the details of the expedition were arranged. It was agreed that Herbert and Pencroff, who understood the management of a boat, were to undertake the voyage alone. By leaving the next day, the 11th of October, they would reach the island, supposing the wind continued, in 48 hours. Allowing for 1 day there, and 3 or 4 days to return in, they could calculate on being at Lincoln Island again on the 17th. The weather was good, the barometer rose steadily, the wind seemed as if it would continue, everything favored these brave men, who were going so far to do a humane act. Thus, Smith, Neb, and Spilett was to remain at Granite House, but at the last moment, the latter, remembering his duty as reporter to the New York Herald, having declared that he would swim rather than lose such an opportunity, was allowed to take part in the voyage. The evening was employed in putting bedding, arms, munitions, provisions, etc., on board, and the next morning, by 5 o'clock, the goodbyes were spoken, and Pencroff, hoisting the sails, headed for Claw Cape, which had to be doubled before taking the route to the southeast. The Good Luck was already a quarter of a mile from shore when her passengers saw upon the heights of Granite House 2 men signaling farewells. They were Smith and Neb, from whom they were separating for the first time in 15 months. Pencroff, Herbert, and the reporter returned the signal, and soon Granite House disappeared behind the rocks of the cape. During the morning, the Good Luck remained in view of the southern coast of the island, which appeared like a green clump of trees, above which rose Mount Franklin. The heights, lessened by distance, gave it an appearance little calculated to attract ships on its coasts. At 1 o'clock Reptile Promontory was past 10 miles distant. It was therefore impossible to distinguish the western coast, which extended to the spurs of the mountain, and 3 hours later, Lincoln Island had disappeared behind the horizon. The Good Luck behaved admirably. She rode lightly over the seas and sailed rapidly. Pencroff had set his topsail, and with a fair wind he followed a straight course by the compass. Occasionally Herbert took the tiller, and the hand of the young lad was so sure, that the sailor had nothing to correct. Spilett chatted with one and the other, and lent a hand when necessary in maneuvering the sloop. Captain Pencroff was perfectly satisfied with his crew, and was constantly promising them an extra allowance of grog. In the evening the slender crescent of the moon glimmered in the twilight. The night came on dark but starlit, with the promise of a fine day on the morrow. Pencroff thought it prudent to take in the topsail, which was perhaps an excess of caution in so still a night, but he was a careful sailor, and was not to be blamed. The reporter slept during half the night, Herbert and Pencroff taking 2 hour turns at the helm. The sailor had as much confidence in his pupil as he had in himself, and his trust was justified by the coolness and judgment of the lad. Pencroff set the course as a captain to his helmsman, and Herbert did not allow the Good Luck to deviate a point from her direction. The night and the next day passed quietly and safely. The Good Luck held her southeast course, and, unless she was drawn aside by some unknown current, she would make Tabor Island exactly. The sea was completely deserted, save that sometimes an albatross or frigate bird passed within gunshot distance. And yet, said Herbert, this is the season when the whalers usually come towards the southern part of the Pacific. I don't believe that there is a sea more deserted than this. It is not altogether deserted, responded Pencroff. What do you mean? Why, we are here. Do you take us for porpoises or our sloop for driftwood? and Pencroff laughed at his pleasantry. By evening they calculated the distance traversed at 130 miles, or 3 1/3 miles an hour. The breeze was dying away, but they had reason to hope, supposing their course to have been correct, that they would sight Tabor Island at daylight. No one of the three slept during this night. While waiting for morning they experienced the liveliest emotions. There was so much uncertainty in their enterprise. Were they near the island? Was the shipwrecked man still there? Who was he? Might not his presence disturb the unity of the colony? Would he, indeed, consent to exchange one prison for another? All these questions, which would doubtless be answered the next day, kept them alert, and at the earliest dawn they began to scan the western horizon. What was the joy of the little crew when towards 6 o'clock Pencroff shouted, "Land!" In a few hours they would be upon its shore. The island was a low coast, raised but a little above the waves, not more than 15 miles away. The sloop, which had been heading south of it, was put about, and, as the sun rose, a few elevations became visible here and there. "It is not as large as Lincoln Island," said Herbert, "and probably owes its origin to like submarine convulsions." By 11 o'clock the Good Luck was only 2 miles distant from shore, and Pencroff, while seeking some place to land, sailed with extreme caution through these unknown waters. They could see the whole extent of this island, on which were visible groups of gum and other large trees of the same species as those on Lincoln Island. But, it was astonishing, that no rising smoke indicated that the place was inhabited, nor was any signal visible upon the shore. Nevertheless the paper had been precise. It stated that there was a shipwrecked man here, and he should have been upon the watch. Meanwhile the Good Luck went in through the tortuous passages between the reefs, Herbert steering, and the sailor stationed forward, keeping a sharp lookout, with the halyards in his hand, ready to run down the sail. Spilett, with the spyglass, examined all the shore without perceiving anything. By noon the sloop touched the beach, the anchor was let go, the sails furled, and the crew stepped on shore. There could be no doubt that that was Tabor Island, since the most recent maps gave no other land in all this part of the Pacific. After having securely moored the sloop, Pencroff and his companion, well armed, ascended the coast towards a round hill, some 250 feet high, which was distant about half a mile, from the summit of which they expected to have a good view of the island. The explorers followed the edge of grassy plain which ended at the foot of the hill. Rock pigeons and sea swallows circled about them, and in the woods bordering the plain to the left they heard rustlings in the bushes and saw movements in the grass indicating the presence of very timid animals, but nothing, so far, indicated that the island was inhabited. Having reached the hill the party soon climbed to its summit, and their gaze traversed the whole horizon. They were certainly upon an island, not more than 6 miles in circumference, in shape a long oval, and but little broken by inlets or promontories. All around it, the sea, absolutely deserted, stretched away to the horizon. This islet differed greatly from Lincoln Island in that it was covered over its entire surface with woods, and the uniform mass of verdure clothed 2 or 3 less elevated hills. Obliquely to the oval of the island a small stream crossed a large grassy plain and emptied into the sea on the western side by a narrowed mouth. "The place is small," said Herbert. "Yes," replied the sailor. "It would have been too small for us." And added the reporter, "It seems uninhabited." "Nevertheless," said Pencroff, "let us go down and search." The party returned to the sloop, and they decided to walk round the entire island before venturing into its interior, so that no place could escape their investigation. The shore was easily followed, and the explorers proceeded towards the south, starting up flocks of aquatic birds and numbers of seals, which latter threw themselves into the sea as soon as they caught sight of the party. "Those beasts are not looking on man for the first time. They fear what they know," said the reporter. An hour after their departure the three had reached the southern point of the islet, which terminated in a sharp cape, and they turned towards the north, following the western shore, which was sandy, like the other, and bounded by a thick wood. In 4 hours after they had set out the party had made the circuit of the island, without having seen any trace of a habitation, and not even a footprint. It was most extraordinary, to say the least, and it seemed necessary to believe that the place was not and had not been inhabited. Perhaps, after all, the paper had been in the water for many months, or even years, and it was possible, in that case, that the shipwrecked one had been rescued or that he had died from suffering. The little party, discussing all sorts of possibilities, made a hasty dinner on board the sloop, and at 5 o'clock started to explore the woods. Numerous animals fled before their approach, principally, indeed solely, goats and pigs, which it was easy to see were of European origin. Doubtless some whaler had left them here, and they had rapidly multiplied. Herbert made up his mind to catch 2 or 3 pairs to take back to Lincoln Island. There was no longer any doubt that the island had previously been visited. This was the more evident as in passing through the forest they saw the traces of pathways, and the trunks of trees felled by the hatchet, and all about, marks of human handiwork, but these trees had been felled years before, the hatchet marks were velveted with moss, and the pathways were so overgrown with grass that it was difficult to discover them. But observed Spilett, this proves that men not only landed here, but that they lived here. Now who and how many were these men, and how many remain? The paper speaks of but one, replied Herbert. Well, said Pencroff, if he is still here we cannot help finding him. The exploration was continued, following diagonally across the island, and by this means the sailor and his companions reached the little stream which flowed towards the sea. If animals of European origin, if works of human hands proved conclusively that man had once been here, many specimens of the vegetable kingdom also evidenced the fact. In certain clear places it was plain that kitchen vegetables had formerly been planted. And Herbert was overjoyed when he discovered potatoes, succory, sorrel, carrots, cabbage, and turnips, the seeds of which would enrich the garden at Granite House. Indeed, exclaimed Pencroff, this will rejoice any bee. Even if we don't find the man, our voyage will not have been useless, and heaven will have rewarded us. Doubtless, replied Spilett, but from the conditions of these fields, it looks as if the place had not been inhabited for a long time. An inhabitant, whoever he was, would not neglect anything so important as this. Yes, this man has gone. It must be that the paper had been written a long time ago. Undoubtedly. And that the bottle had been floating in the sea a good while before it arrived at Lincoln Island. Why not? Said Pencroff. But, see, it is getting dark, he added, and I think we had better give over the search. We will go aboard, and tomorrow we will begin again, replied the reporter. They were about adopting this counsel, when Herbert, pointing to something dimly visible, through the trees, exclaimed, "There's a house." All 3 directed their steps towards the place indicated, and they made out in the twilight that it was built of planks, covered with heavy tarpaulin. The door, half closed, was pushed back by Pencroff, who entered quickly. The place was empty.